אומרים לי שאני...
Good afternoon and welcome to Liberal Judaism at Home. It is an absolute privilege to be able to welcome to our at home programming His Excellency Ambassador Mark Regev, the Ambassador from the State of Israel here in the UK, and also to be joined effectively on my sofa by Graham Carpenter, who is a member of the Liberal Judaism Board with responsibility for Israel. And just for the next hour to be in conversation and also to invite questions from you at home. But just before we begin, first of all, Ambassador, thank you so much for agreeing to join us, or actually offering to join us at Liberal Judaism. We met a lot of times over the years, mainly at dinners, and it feels somewhat, I don't think I ever imagined that I'd be inviting you into my home for a cup of tea, but delighted that I can. And I feel like maybe it's apt, really, because I think you have been, particularly for Liberal Judaism, the ambassador that we've had the most contact with. You've made a huge effort with our community to be part of our events and to hear our voice and listen to our thanks, but also to our concerns and to the things that we've needed. And I know that for Graham and I, we've got a huge amount of questions for you. But before we begin, maybe you can tell us how this situation with coronavirus has affected you and your work, particularly the fact that you're here in our living rooms, but also for Israel and how you see the situation there at the moment. Oh, Ambassador, I'm really sorry, but we seem to...
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you perfectly.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I would say the following. The reason we're doing this is because in many ways we've all had to because of social distancing, and if we want to stay in contact, this is the only way we can do it, really. I mean, you're correct. Since coming to London, we've had a lot of contact. I've made an effort to visit quite a few liberal congregations in my time here and your other events, and I see it as an important part of my job. And this is the way we're going to continue to do it until we get the all clear that social distancing is no longer necessary. So I thank you for the invitation to speak to you and your people. To answer your question about Israel, if I look at the numbers of fatalities in Israel from coronavirus are actually very, very low. Now, every fatality is obviously a world. In Judaism, we say, you know this better than me, Rabbi, that saving one life is like saving all of humanity. But our numbers are very low. And I'll share with you a statistic that is very troubling, and I can't explain it. But in Israel, we've had less than 200 deaths from coronavirus. Now, once again, every death is a tragedy. But if you compare that per capita with other countries, that's a very low figure. Mm-hmm. And now I'll give you another statistic, which is troubling in the extreme. I understand from the leadership of the UK Jewish community that over 250 British Jews have passed away because of coronavirus. That means, if you connect the two, more British Jews have died than Israelis. Now, there are some 300,000 British Jews. There's close to 9 million Israelis. What's going on here? Now, I don't know all the answers. I really don't know all the answers. I just do know that it appears in Israel we are doing, on this issue, we're doing some things right. We're all learning because this is new for everyone. It's learning on the job, yes, how to deal with this. But the fact that we've kept our death numbers relatively low in Israel is, I think, a significant accomplishment.
Yes, I think we can all acknowledge that it's a significant accomplishment. And I think also many of us with family and friends in Israel are also very grateful for that. I want to explore a little bit more our relationship as liberal Jews, particularly with Israel at the moment, but also in the greater picture. Certainly liberal Judaism would see itself as a Zionist organization, even if within that we hold a real multitude of views within it. And the fact that you're even mentioning about the comparison between the number of British Jews and Israeli Jews goes a little way to talk about what I want to talk about, which is that sense of mutuality between Israel and the UK particularly. We've always built our Zionism around the idea about relationship, about how do we engage in a mutual understanding. And I think often we've heard from Israel why they think our relationship is important with Israel. Why is it important for us in the UK to have a relationship with Israel? Why do you think it's important? How would you frame that Zionist relationship in the context of why is it important for Israel to be in relationship with the UK or with British Jews or liberal Jews in particular?
Because we're family. Let's be clear. We've all got, and I'm speaking metaphorically, yes, but we've all got grandparents who got on a boat from somewhere in Eastern Europe, and some of them got on a boat and went to London, some of them got on a boat and went to New York, and some of them got on a boat and went to Israel. And we're all from the same common sources, yes? We're family, we're extended family. And there's a special connection that Jews feel as Jews, and that is something that's part of our identity. I think it's as simple as that. And please go ahead, Rabbi.
I was just wondering whether you think that always comes across in terms of that relationship, that there is a sense from Israel that the relationship with the diaspora is as important as the diaspora's relationship with Israel.
I have no doubt it's a two-way street, yes. And I'm sure it's sometimes Israeli Jews, Israelis as a whole are more involved in what's going on in their immediate vicinity, and sometimes maybe not as conscious as they should be on what's going on in diaspora communities. I'm sure diaspora communities are sometimes so involved in what's going on with them, especially if they're facing a crisis, that they can sometimes not focus on Israel. But it's like any relationship. You can't take it for granted. You have to work. In any relationship between two partners, you have to work to keep the relationship positive. You can't take your partner for granted. And it's the same in a relationship like the one between Israel and Jewish communities abroad. We have to work to make it succeed.
I really appreciate that comment about working from both sides, because it is a lovely segue into, I think, where Greg wants to take this conversation next, which is with a new government and new struggles, and feels particularly prescient this morning. I think many of us in the progressive Jewish community are wondering where this new standing leaves our relationship and leaves that working together. Maybe, Graham, you could take our conversation a little bit further.
So firstly, I just want to reiterate that on behalf of the board of Liberal Judaism, I want to thank the ambassador for reaching out and devoting his time to this webinar. The relationship that he has built, and the mutual relationship is not something we take for granted, and that the two-way doors have always been open for hearing and you answering our questions is really, really important. And again, similar to Charley, never did I think that I would be interviewing the Israeli ambassador from my family home. So it's in that respect, it's a real honor and privilege of the role as well. Ambassador, we have met once or twice before at various communal events, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to ask you some questions today. Some other things about me, just to frame my approach. I'm also a board member for the World Union for Progressive Judaism, so the umbrella movement around the world. And in my professional career, I work for Olam, which is the umbrella organization of Israeli and Jewish international development and humanitarian aid organizations. So at this time, with a pandemic that is asking big global questions, I am constantly reflecting on how interconnected we all are, and how, even though our attention is focused on the hyperlocal, our neighbors during this time of need, we know that our friends in Israel and my friends in South Africa and the States are also tackling the same challenge, and there's something that really brings us together. And I have a few questions about that, but I want to cut straight to the chase, which is that we speak at a momentous time. Not only are we in lockdown, but we are just after Pesach, when we told the story of Jewish liberation from slavery in Egypt. We are in between the national Israeli festivals of Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut. And after 3 elections and a year of electoral stalemate, we finally have a government in Israel, which I'm sure you are relieved about. And I want to ask you about what the challenges that this new government faces. Not only the pandemic, but also about annexation. I want to cut straight to the chase. Prime Minister Netanyahu campaigned in his election campaign with putting annexation firmly on the table. And in the power sharing and political arrangement that's been formed with Benny Gantz in this new government, it looks like they'll be able to do that on the 1st of June. So the challenges for that, for me, are around, obviously, the big geopolitical, what does that mean for things like peace agreements with your neighbors, but also down to our relationship. There is a multitude of views within our movement, but there is also a majority, I think, who oppose annexation and supported a 2-state solution. Some would say this is the death of that 2-state solution. And so does that affect our relationship with the state of Israel? Your thoughts? Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, you're correct, Graham. The first challenge of this new unity government will be to deal effectively with the coronavirus crisis and to keep people alive. And that's a given, yeah? That has to happen, and that's all the energy and all the oxygen in the system is going in that direction. Mm-hmm. On the issue which you raise of annexation, it's something the Prime Minister put in his election program and something he believes in. I want to stress, and your Israeli politics better than most, that the idea that the Jordan Valley should stay part of Israel in any possible peace agreement with the Palestinians is not a Netanyahu idea. It's not a Likud idea. It actually goes back to the labor movement and the Labour Party. I hope I'm not being too wonkish, but it goes back to what people knew as the Alon Plan, which was part of the way the labor movement looked at possible solutions to peace with the Palestinians. In fact, I would refer you to a speech given by Yitzhak Rabin. I think it was in October 95, just a few weeks before he was murdered by a Jewish terrorist. His last speech in the Knesset. And he talks about, this is after signing the agreements with the Palestinians, the Oslo process and all that. And Rabin says that in his view of peace with the Palestinians, first of all, he says Jerusalem has to remain united under Israeli control. But he also said specifically the Jordan Valley has to be under Israeli control. He says he always saw that as crucial for Israel's long-term viability and security. So I'm not telling you that you have to accept Rabin's position. Yes, you will decide what your own politics is. But to understand that these issues are not as partisan as sometimes they're played here. And the idea that in any permanent framework with the Palestinians, yes, that any Israeli government would ask to stay on the Jordan Valley. Now, the Palestinians don't accept this, yes, but the Israeli position is the Jordan Valley should stay part of Israel. The idea being is obviously for security reasons, right? If you go back to the 67 borders, at their narrowest point, what are they? They're 12 kilometers around Kfar Saba right? And the idea was to give Israel some breadth. Now, as you know, the founders of the Alon Plan talked about compromise with our neighbors. And Rabin definitely believed in compromise. He was the pioneer of the Oslo process. So I don't accept an argument that would say this prevents a two-state solution if that's what's decided in the end. Yes, I don't think it rules it out. Rabin didn't think it ruled it out.
So thank you. So I think there's an element of kind of that was then and this is now. And, you know, we're in 2020 and that the democratic principles of annexation, you know, really fundamentally challenge our relationship with it. You know, often people use the phrase Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, but I think even if it is for security reasons, annexation of the Jordan Valley still takes a significant portion of Palestinian residents and puts them under Israeli control in a way that you know, isn't democratic for me. So that really challenges my relationship personally with Israel, even if, you know, historically there is precedent for that.
I'd answer you the following way, if you'll permit me.
Yeah.
First of all, you could have made the same argument about Jerusalem and about the Golan Heights as well. Maybe you would, yes? Those territories were also formally attached to Israel. Israeli law was extended to those areas as well. But I'll tell you a personal story, and maybe, Graham, you can relate to this. Yeah. I actually grew up in Habonim, yes? And in Habonim, we were taught, or we taught ourselves, I can't blame anyone, yeah? There was an affinity with the left. And when I made Aliyah, I did so out of a fundamental belief in Zionism, and I said, I will vote that terrible government out of office. I remember thinking that, yes? And I remember when I got my Israeli ID card, I said, that's it, I can finally vote and make my voice felt, right? So I'd say to you, Graham, yes, if you are really committed to these issues and you want to make a difference, right? And I'm not telling you what political views you should have, that's your choice, yes? But be there and vote the way you think you should vote. That's the way to make an influence, because Israel ultimately is a democracy. Now, it can be very frustrating maybe for you that Israeli voters are not voting the way you want them to vote, yes? If there were more members maybe of the UK liberal community, liberal Judaism making Aliyah, so maybe you'd have more voters voting the way you'd like them to vote, yes? But ultimately you have the ability to affect, right? Israel is, as I said before, it's a democracy, and I'm proud of that. It's also, remember, and the politics we have to discuss, this government, and if you've read the guidelines, and it hasn't been established yet, though I think it's just a matter of days now for them to have the ceremony, it's based on parity. So the Likud and the parties in the Likud bloc are 50% of the government, 50% of the cabinet, 50% of all relevant committees, and Blue and White together with Labour are going to make up the other 50%. So neither side, according to the way this is structured, has the ability to unilaterally dominate the government. It has to be based everything on consensus. So this government, by its own logic, yes, will have to be a government that will have to rule, I think, from the center.
Thank you for that clarification. I think that's really important. And I also hope that that you're right, that, you know, if annexation does go ahead, we still have a path to a two-state solution and liberation of Palestinians. I'm going to move us on to my other question around this area, which I think is especially important at this time, which is one of the key values of liberal Judaism is inclusion. We're a very inclusive community. And I see it extremely strongly in our amazing youth movement, our Zionist youth movement, LJY Netzer, that they get worked up around the challenges facing minorities and groups within Israel, vulnerable groups within Israel. So during this time, this pandemic, I'm interested to know, what's your perspective on what is Israel's responsibility to the minorities within its society? And just to make some specific examples, I mean, of course, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, but also asylum seekers in Tel Aviv and the Bedouin, to name just a few.
So obviously, coronavirus affects everybody. And I said before that for all countries, Israel included, this was learning on the job, right? Because this came quickly and unexpectedly, and everyone has been, in Britain too, everyone's learning how best to deal with this. So what we've discovered is, like, we did a whole campaign to tell people to stay indoors and they shouldn't be doing this and they shouldn't be doing that and to socially isolate and so forth. And when you're doing it, let's say, on Israeli television and on the radio, and you're reaching the majority of Israelis, but you're not reaching them all. We had, as you know, with the ultra-Orthodox community, there were specific challenges. And of course, ultra-Orthodox, at least a large part of the ultra-Orthodox community, they're not watching the main news in the evenings on Israeli television. They're not listening to the radio, and they're not reading the regular newspapers. So you have to communicate to that community through the media that community is following. Yes, and maybe you have to work with their religious leadership. Same thing with Israeli Arabs. Not just Bedouin in the Negev, the entire Israeli Arab community, especially now with Ramadan. Mm-hmm. Prime Minister Netanyahu, I thought, handled this specific issue of Ramadan very carefully. He said, just as we asked the Jews over Passover not to get together and not to do large family dinners, we're asking Israel's Muslims over Ramadan to do the same. In other words, to make it clear that this is something that we're asking of ourselves before we ask it of you. In other words, you have to speak in a language that will not be seen. If you're seen as a hostile government who's just oppressing, you've got to be able to speak, as you said, in an inclusive way. Yeah. As you know, with both communities, they were, for all the reasons we've discussed and others, they were a bit behind, yes? And so you have higher cases of coronavirus in the ultra-Orthodox community, and you have, to a certain extent, higher cases in Israel's Arab community, and we have to work more effectively. Both those communities, of course, have maybe a touch more complicated relationship with the organs of the Israeli state than, let's say, other regular, for want of a better word, Israelis. In regarding your question vis-a-vis the West Bank and the Palestinians there and in Gaza.
You remind, I just clarify for our watchers that Ramadan starts tonight, I believe.
Correct.
Yes.
Well, I have to tweet. Yes, it's important for me to put out a message. That's what ambassadors do.
Yeah.
Vis-a-vis Palestine, what we've done is we've adopted a very, very strong position of working as best we can with the Palestinians, making sure that their health services are beefed up so they can deal with the crisis. On the West Bank, it's easier because we work directly with all the problems we have with the Palestinian Authority and all the disagreements and all the criticisms we have, and we have them. We're nevertheless, we see them as a partner, and we're working with them, and we've been providing support, and we've been facilitating international support for them. We understand that this is a common challenge, and we're putting politics aside, and we want to work together to make this happen. To be frank, it doesn't help when leaders of the Palestinian Authority start with these sort of conspiracy theories that I'm sure you've seen in the newspapers, that the terrible Israelis are deliberately spreading coronavirus to kill Palestinians, right? Unfortunately, we've had some very senior leaders of the Palestinian Authority, not just voices on Facebook, but say these sort of things publicly. It's almost like the blood libel. The Jews are poisoning the wells, right? Yeah. We are nevertheless continuing a process of cooperation, and we understand that we're all in this together, and we're working very closely with the Palestinian Authority. In Gaza, it's more complicated because the Palestinian Authority has no control there. And even more so, they've taken a decision because resources are limited. They're totally focused on the West Bank. They're doing nothing for Gaza. And so we've been working here with the United Nations, which has established a special fund to help Gaza beef up its potential to be able to deal with the virus. I can tell you Israeli ambassadors around the world, including myself, have been speaking to host governments, asking people to support this UN fund. We've also been doing all sorts of things with Gaza. Some of them I can talk about, some of them I can't talk about. to see what we can do to help the medical authorities there better deal with the challenges. It's not easy, but things are happening. I'll give you an example, though. One of the challenges are there was a peace activist in Gaza who was talking about this and speaking to his Israeli counterparts, and he was arrested by Hamas because he was speaking to Israel. So if we're doing things to help Palestinian doctors in Gaza and so forth, we have to be very discreet because we don't want to see them in jail, and this is part of the reality. So far, and this is Gaza's the borders are closed between Israel and Gaza and Gaza and Egypt, and so maybe because it's been relatively isolated so far, and I say so far, it could change. They have had very, very low numbers and have been able to contain. I hope it stays that way.
So I think we need to move on to some questions from our audience. Am I right, Charley? But I'll just say a thank you because, I frame these questions around the way that we would like Israel to act and what, when we look back on this time, how would we have, the ideals that we would like Israel to behave. And certainly a lot of what you just said is doing as much as we can for our neighbors in these circumstances. So thank you.
It's great to hear you engaging with, I think, what are some particular issues for our community. But the issue that I hear time and time again, and actually it's one that you almost covered when you covered your own personal story about making Aliyah from a Habanim background. I too made Aliyah post Shnat Netzer, and went to live in Israel, and that was a while ago now. And one of the things that I discovered very, very quickly when I was in Israel, that was despite making Aliyah from a Jewish youth movement, from coming out of practicing Jewish home, of having, as you see by my current profession, a very strong Jewish identity, maybe even a learned Jewish identity, that I couldn't have got married in Israel because my mother did a progressive conversion, that there were parts of Israeli society of being a Jew in Israel which were restricted to me because of how somebody else defined my Jewish identity. And that we have soldiers who fight for Israel and then can't get married in Israel, can't be buried in Jewish cemeteries. It's really problematic, particularly for those of us who are working very closely with the Israeli progressive movement. And the current situation has really highlighted that for many of my colleagues in Israel, my progressive colleague, rabbis in Israel, who currently financially are really struggling, that while the state continues to fund the state rabbis, that those rabbis who actually are officiating to a really much needed part of Israeli society are worrying about their salaries and funding their communities. And for me, that's a really personal struggle with a country that I deeply love, I feel deeply in relationship with, but I feel constantly excludes me, despite my commitment to it. And
first of all, I understand everything that you've just said, and I not only can I understand, I empathize. Though I would say you should have stayed there and fought for your rights and not given up. Yes, that's my opinion, right?
Well, we can agree to disagree about how we fight for Israel. And I am 100%, I believe in, when I talk about mutuality and that relationship, that Israel within the progressive world needs strong advocates for it in the UK. And our communities of building that is in some ways a much more difficult task to do from here. And at that time, further, one more thing, which is that I couldn't at that time have been a community rabbi in Israel. That actually, due to those fundings, that if I want to pursue something that I hold in deep tension and deep relationship with, I could not have done that within Israel. And right now, I wouldn't have been able to pay my bills and sustain my family.
Understood. And look, let's now get to the issues that you raised, the substance of them. And the truth is that in Israel, we inherited from the British Mandate, and they inherited from the Turkish, that each religious community autonomously administers its own religious affairs. And in Israel, that's the Orthodox Rabbinate.
Sure.
And it's the same in the UK, and it's the same in Israel. The Orthodox Rabbinate has a problem giving recognition to progressive rabbis. In many ways, it's easier for them to deal with secular Israelis like me than reform or liberal Israelis, because for them to give legitimacy is a problem. Orthodoxy believes that it's the only legitimate Jewish expression, correct? That's part of being, in many ways, that's the DNA of Jewish Orthodoxy. That's why they're called Orthodox. And so you have a situation in Israel where, as long as you have that the rabbinate is in charge of religious affairs, so Reform Jews, liberal Jews, Masorti Jews are not going to receive the same recognition. That's the glass that is half empty. I think it's fair to say also that there is a glass that is half full, and that is the incredible renaissance in progressive Judaism in Israel over the last few years. I remember when I first made Aliyah in the early 1980s, if you went to a Reform congregation, you would everyone would be an Oleh Hadash from America or Canada or somewhere like in the West, or they were old people who came from Germany in the 1930s. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yet in recent years, say in the last 2 decades, you've seen a whole change with Reform progressive Judaism in Israel. You see congregations filling up with Israelis. You see Israelis, when they need a congregation to do a bar mitzvah for, right, they are going to progressive synagogues. And
or a bar mitzvah, maybe more importantly.
Yeah, bar mitzvahs, weddings, yeah. You see more and more because some Israelis don't feel comfortable with the rabbinate. And so you're seeing growth, yes, and movement in a direction which I think, from your perspective, should be seen as positive. Now, if you're going to tell me half the glass is still empty from your perspective, I understand that. But I don't think you can ignore the half glass that's full, yes? There are even some examples, if I'm not mistaken, of where Reform congregations, I know it's maybe an exception to the norm, but the barrier has been broken, where Reform congregations, liberal congregations in Israel have received funding from local authorities. And that wasn't there a few years ago. It's there now. So maybe if you looked at it a continuum, yes, you could say when you lived in Israel after making Aliyah, things were X, now they're X plus 2, maybe X plus 4, right? So in other words, one can see the Supreme Court has made a lot of decisions which have been very helpful. To tell you that, for me to promise you that tomorrow Reform Jews, liberal Jews are going to have total equality, yes, with the Orthodox, I can't, yes. I can say that Israeli society is increasingly pluralist. Israeli society is increasingly accepting. The progressive Jews in Israel have a voice that they didn't used to have. They have a presence that they didn't used to have. And the overwhelming principle is that Israel, and I know this, Israel was created for all Jews.
Yeah.
Israel was not created for liberal Jews. Israel was not created for Reform Jews. It wasn't created for Masorti Jews. It wasn't created for Orthodox Jews. It wasn't created for secular Jews. Israel was created for all Jews. And all Jews should feel comfortable in Israel. I'll give you an example. I was, in my previous position, I was there when the cabinet voted to find a compromise for the Kotel, yes?
Yeah.
And then the compromise didn't work, but there was a serious attempt to try to find a situation where all Jews could pray by the Kotel in a way that they could feel comfortable. Now, compromises, because they're compromises, are never perfect because no side gets everything that it wants. But a lot of this is trying to find working arrangements that can help people, live and live together. One final point before you come back to me,
which I will.
Yes, on this issue, there's one fundamental rule about politics, though, and this is about politics. It applies in Britain and in America, and it applies in Israel too. When ultra-Orthodox Jews vote, they have one overriding issue, correct?
Correct.
When Reform, liberal, progressive Jews in Israel vote, they're thinking about many, many other things as well, correct?
That's true.
And so this allows the ultra-Orthodox to have a say, which is, but once again, that's democracy. People who vote for Shas don't have their right to put their opinion forward. Of course they do. So I go to say the same thing I did. If 10,000 liberal Jews in the United Kingdom picked up and said, we want to be Israelis and vote, that would make a difference, would it not?
You're right. And I think the general feeling is that we know exactly why you're an ambassador and a diplomat. It's a great advocate for Israel and its glass half full. I just wonder, though, whether you think that if push came to shove, I think that the reform movement in Israel, you're right, has made great inroads, and actually I think has been a huge asset to Israeli society in that revitalization of a relationship with Judaism. That if push came to shove and the reform movement was fatally damaged by the situation financially, would it be incumbent upon the state to save it?
I can't answer that question because I don't know. I don't know. And there could be politics, it depend on who controls this committee in the Knesset or something like that. But you have to ask the following question. As my opinion, from what I understand, what the Reform and progressive Jews in Israel have been doing is they wanted to try to differentiate between the rabbinate and the state of Israel, yes? Mm. And so if you're asking for state support, is that consistent with a position which has been that we don't want anyone? We want everyone to be sort of independent, or local authorities to do everything, to be more authentic. So the whole idea of religious communities receiving state aid, I understand you're saying if one group receives, maybe we should do as well. But I think the position of the progressive Jews in Israel is the opposite. But I don't know. I can't answer your question.
I think sometimes, ambiguity for either side can be advantageous in certain situations. In fact, we've had a question come to us from somebody specifically asking, in this situation, in the current coronavirus, is there a way to make an invitation to Israel? Can people make Aliyah?
First of all, yes, there's a woman here from the Sochnut who's a lovely woman, Leah Golan, who deals with all these applications for Aliyah. And what I do want to say to people, especially to younger people, yes, though is that I believe very strongly that Israel is a country which has a very limited glass ceiling. And if someone like me, who was born in Australia, yes, who came to live in Israel at the age of 21, can end up being ambassador, and if there are countless other examples that Israel is a country where people it's small enough that you can make a difference and you can get ahead. And I see that all across Israel, where people who came from other countries have really made an impact. But so people can make Aliyah. It's a bit more difficult this week because we used to have like 12 flights a day. Do you know that we had, I think it was flying between Israel and the UK, and as ambassador I do it a lot, yes? Not in the last 2 weeks, obviously. But you had British and El Al. You had the two budget airlines. You had EasyJet and Wizz Air. Yeah. You had Ryan doing some flights as well, and then you had Virgin join. You had six airlines, and whenever I flew, the planes were always full, right? And there was a lot of traffic. Today, obviously, because of all what's going on, if there's one flight every 3 weeks at the moment, we're very happy, yes? Apparently, there's one flight next week, and theoretically, I think British and El Al might be starting in May. That's the major issue about people going to Israel today. There's also, at the moment, people who are not Israeli citizens can't go to visit Israel unless there are special reasons, like if they're married to an Israeli or something like that. And Israelis who land in Israel today cannot self-isolate. They have to go to a government-authorized quarantine center. Yeah. This is part of us fighting. So if someone's making Aliyah and they really want to do it, they can get on that plane next week and still go to the government-authorized quarantine center for 2 weeks, yes? But I would think it's probably better if you can hold off to wait until things get back to a bit normal, because it is a bit strange. But yes, theoretically, yes, even though the country is closed now to foreign visitors, if you make Aliyah, you become an Israeli citizen, so you'd be allowed to come, I think.
So I've been seeing from my friends on social media that Israel is starting to open up. Or at least the general public have kind of taken it upon themselves that maybe they're fed up of lockdown, and clearly there's an enthusiasm to get back to work and for the economy, and this conversation between vulnerable lives and the economy is a tough one we're facing as well. But what what does it look like now in terms of the easing of restrictions, and how are the Israeli public responding? Is this low number of deaths a false, a challenging, a figure that's going to kind of hide the true danger of the virus for them?
So we don't know. That's the truth.
Yeah.
And now, because we've been successful, people say, well, we can be a bit more open, and we can lesser the restrictions. And then people say, well, there are examples of countries where they've let the restrictions out a bit and you've had a return of the virus. So I think the attitude of the government is to do things very carefully, to do things in a very measured way, to hear the science, right? And to do this, obviously, look, the restrictions, the more strict you are, the more you're going to save lives, right? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, people are unemployed, people aren't making money, the economy's closed down, culture is closed down, people aren't seeing family and so forth, right? It can't be open-ended. And so we're trying to find the magical middle ground, which will be based on the best way to handle this situation. And I think we're talking about a measured, incremental return to something that is closer to what things were like before this crisis. But I think it could take time. I think if the Israeli government has to make a decision, it'll be to err on the side of caution. Because Rabbi, you know this better than anyone else. In Judaism, human life comes before anything else. Even an Orthodox Jew will eat on Yom Kippur if it's to save his life, correct?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the issues that we're particularly thinking about here in terms of going back to normal, whatever normal in the future looks like, is the impact on our 16-year-olds who should have been spending thousands and thousands of British youth spend their summer in Israel. And this year, very sadly, I'm not going to be in Israel. And we know that long-term programming is very key to that relationship with Israel, that we disproportionately large number of liberal young people still do year course in Israel. We have a higher number really from liberal Jewish communities spending a year in Israel, and we know that that's a retention rate from our Israel tour. And I wonder whether you've given any thought to what that impact might be on that relationship just from a summer really of if it's only a summer, but certainly a summer of thousands of young people not being in Israel.
So first of all, I know it's a tragedy. I know when I get together with other Israeli ambassadors and we have our conferences and so forth, I always say with pride, British Jews are amazing in their relationship with Israel. And I point to that example of the 16-year-olds, such a high proportion go. It must be one of the highest in the world where a community is sending literally thousands of its young people, and it's such a high proportion. I think it's well over 50%, if I'm not mistaken, Rabbi. And this is an amazing thing. Now, obviously, it wasn't possible this year. So hopefully next year it will be possible. And then we have to think creatively, how do we compensate the people who were supposed to go this year and couldn't, because they can't be forgotten. I don't know how we'll do it, yes. And obviously there are economic issues here involved as well, because there's only a certain amount of money that you can raise every year and so forth. But we have to try to, hopefully by this time this happens next year, we'll be back to something closer to normal, and that we find a way once again to compensate those people that couldn't go this summer. I don't know, maybe you've got some good ideas on this. I'm sure the people who are in the education side will be having ideas too. But it's true, it's a tragedy that these young people couldn't go this year. It's something that I'm very proud of when I work with the Jewish community, these programs where every summer, from the different Jewish organizations, the different streams of Judaism, they're sending thousands of young people to Israel to experience the country. It's important, it's crucial. I myself, if I can speak personally, I went at the age of 16, the first time to Israel on a program organized by the Australian equivalent of the UJIA, and I know how important that was for me, right? And so not everyone decides after a program like that to make Aliyah, but everyone has a feeling for Israel, for the country, for their heritage. It's crucial, those programs.
I think you're absolutely right that not only do we know from data the difference that those programming mean, but we all know, at least the three of us sitting in this space know the impact of long-term programming in Israel, of building that relationship. And that's really where we began this conversation in many ways, was about that sense of mutuality. And in terms of ideas, I would also like to see more and more Israeli young people spending time within progressive communities in the UK, because actually I think we have things to offer as well to Israeli society that comes out of that mutual sense of responsibility. I do wonder whether for you, what we talk about a lot in many of our informal settings, we do a virtuality, virtual tea every day. And one of the conversations I find having a lot with people is, what are they taking out of this time? What do they see shaping them from, if there is something positive, and I know we can't always go to glass half full, but if you are taking something creative or something positive out this time, somewhere that something that you say we should never go back from having learned this, do you have something that you would share with us?
So the first thing I've discovered, I've got all this time at home that I didn't used to have. Mm-hmm. Because Rabbi, we would meet each other at different Jewish charity events, yes? And during the season, it was almost like one every night. And I always, as an Israeli ambassador, I said, if someone's raising money for an Israeli university or an Israeli special needs or for blind dogs, whatever they were doing, yes, I always thought I had to be there. And suddenly, over these last month, my schedule in the evenings, I get home in the evenings and I don't have something to do. So I've been using my time to read. I like to read. I can obviously connect. That's the good thing with my immediate family, which is something that we sometimes forget. We're so busy with our careers and our work in the community that we can forget the people who are the most closest to us. And so I think that's maybe one of the positive things of coronavirus. And also maybe you think about our mortality, yes? I mean, unlike you two, I'm in a risk category, yes? I'm over 60. And so one thinks about one's own, we have to be humble about ourselves, yes? Especially when you've got a high-powered job like being ambassador or being a rabbi, yes? One can think one is, one is invincible, one is changing the world, and this makes you rediscover perspective, maybe.
So it's, I think, a really important lesson for all of us, actually. I think it is also quite universal and something that all of us are thinking about. We may not all be ambassadors, but certainly I think many of us have been conscious about where we can make the most impact and actually sometimes where we can stop and say. But I do wonder whether it makes you think about your legacy as ambassador to the UK. I said right at the beginning that it's been quite a special relationship, I think, between the embassy and liberal Judaism. I know our former chair, Simon Bencher, spoke very, very proudly of the fact that you had been to our patrons' dinner and to our liberal Judaism events, how much that meant to us as a movement. And we won't always agree. We definitely won't always agree, but you've always provided us with a space to be able to challenge, and we have appreciated that. But I wonder for you, as you think of, hopefully not too much about your own mortality, but maybe about your time as ambassador in the UK, what is it that you would like to think is your legacy in this role?
I don't know. It's a tough question to answer because I'm due to finish this summer, so I'm coming to the end. So it is time to get to do some sort of summary of the 4 years that I've been here. But I don't know. Maybe I need more perspective. I hope that I've reached out to all the elements in the Jewish community. And just as you said to me that we'll disagree on some things, So I can tell you I've got letters from other branches of the community who've also written to me that they were not happy with a certain thing that I did or I said, yes.
Sure.
People who follow my tweets say, why did you tweet that? Don't you know that that's against or something? So, look, you can't keep everyone happy the whole time. You have to be yourself. You have to do the job, yes. Obviously, for me, there were two overriding things that I had to deal with as ambassador that other people didn't have, or my predecessors didn't. First of all, there was the whole anti-Semitism thing that really reached a crescendo in the. I mean, apparently it's now behind us, but it was definitely that was definitely casting a shadow over everything that I was doing and over the Jewish community. I mean, to a certain extent, the UK Jewish community has gone through probably one of the, in the last year, one of the largest crises in its history. And now, following that crisis, the coronavirus crisis, which means, synagogues that were open during the Blitz, right, that were, despite the Luftwaffe bombing London, they stayed open, are now closed because of coronavirus, which is a different sort of crisis. But I suppose there are the issues that I'll remember my time here. Well, I can tell you this, yes. I'm not sure this had anything to do with me, but it was because I was the beneficiary of it, yes. You have to be in the right place at the right time. So during my watch as ambassador, we had the first ever visit by a senior British royal to the state of Israel. Now, you'll know that for many years, there were many Israelis who were frustrated because they saw members of the British royal family going to our neighbors, yes, and not just once or twice, but many times. And they never came to Israel. And people in Israel, at least some thought, what the British consider as second-class citizens. The royal family goes to all sorts of countries in the region and they never came to us. It was almost as if there was, it's not the royals' decision. These decisions are taken obviously in other places, yes?
Sure.
But I'm glad to say that in my time here, we've had not one, but we've had 2 royal visits, yes? We had the first one by William, and now Prince of Wales came for the ceremony at Yad Vashem in January for the 75th liberation of Auschwitz, and so I'm glad that we now have a normal relationship at the very top of the British state as well, because those visits obviously are symbolic, but the symbolism is important.
Thank you very much. I know that Graham has a final question that's been sent to him that he'd like to ask you before we wrap up this.
Yeah, and I've been told, so I've got one final serious question for you, Ambassador, and one final fun question. So I'm hoping we can end on the fun one. But the serious one, and I've also been told to make it snappy, so I'm hoping you can go with a one-word answer. What comes to mind? And this particularly is something that is I think the reason it's been asked as a question is because, again, going back to what I was talking about earlier, it's a very important issue for young progressive Jews, especially like myself. But about just going back to annexation, someone asked, will the Palestinians living in the occupied and soon to be annexed territories be given full citizenship and equal rights with Jewish Israelis?
So the answer, I think, is unequivocally yes. Let's use the example of the Golan Heights. When the Golan Heights were annexed, all the residents there were offered Israeli citizenship. I don't think all of them took it, but they are definitely offered that. So that's the precedent.
Very
quick question, quick answer.
Very quick.
Very much. And the fun answer, someone noticed your mug. So we were just wondering, we're all at home, all in our front rooms. What's on your mug? It is the Rolling Stones.
So that's my generation, yes?
That's your generation. And you see my generation? Eve was framed.
Oh. So it's my generation's is the Rolling Stones. And I have to tell you, they came to play in Israel for the first time.
Yeah.
I was there. It must have been like 2011, maybe it was 12. I don't remember exactly.
It was very recently.
Yeah. And I remember going to the park in Tel Aviv, and it was a concert outside. And because we have better weather in summer than you do here in Britain, you can do a concert outside because it's not going to rain. And for me, having the Rolling Stones play in Israel, that was like the ultimate victory of Zionism, because they can go anywhere in the world and they'll fill out a crowd. That they chose to come to Israel, and we really filled out the audience. And that's the generation I grew up with. Yes, I have a problem because diplomats are supposed to be associated with opera and Mozart, and and that's that's what diplomats are supposed to do. But I'm a Rolling Stones person. I used my time here in London to visit their last concert that was here. When was that? Last year or the year before?
The year before.
I went to hear them here. And if I'm like washing the dishes and I want to listen to music, or if I'm running and I want to listen to music, my first point of call, my wife will tell you that it's because I don't mature. Like what I liked at the age of 19 is what I like today.
I think that's true for most of us.
Yeah, definitely.
I when I made Aliyah, I I used to manage live music bars. So
Oh,
that
cool.
was, you know, that was very much Rolling Stones was on our, very high on our playlist. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us at home, for sharing with us your mug and your music tastes, but also some honest answers and, as always, your excellent diplomatic skills. But mostly, we want to thank you for building the relationship with us and for always being willing to hear our voice. And we wish you that you and your family stay safe during this time, and look forward to our next conversation. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me, and you should all be healthy, and that we come out of this crisis, soon, and that we all keep our health and don't take unnecessary risks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Bye-bye.